What you're about to hear is a first-person confession, inspired by the real story, or perhaps the legend, of the language deprivation experiments conducted on a child raised in total isolation. She was discovered by accident, a girl, barely formed, living like an animal in the back of a darkened house. No words, no comprehension, no name she recognized. The others saw tragedy. I saw opportunity. The Institute gave me full access. They wanted answers. Could language be taught from nothing? Could thought be rewritten, word by word, into a mind untouched by speech? I told them yes, but this is not about what we taught her. It's about what she gave back, what she mirrored, what she learned to repeat. This is not a story of education. It's a record of contamination. And if there's still a voice inside me that's my own, I no longer know what it sounds like. They brought her in through the back entrance. No press releases. Just a stretcher, 2 plainclothes officers, and a girl wrapped in a hospital sheet. She weighed almost nothing. Her hair was matted to one side. Her arms were locked in an unnatural curve, like she hadn't stretched them in years. She didn't cry. She didn't ask where she was. She didn't speak. They said she'd been found in a small room. No windows, no lights, a single cot bolted to the floor. A metal potty chair. Food passed under the door. For 13 years, she had lived like that. Isolated. Wordless. They thought she might be feral. I thought she might be clean. I watched as she was placed in the observation room, a 2-way mirror separating her from the medical staff. She didn't resist. She simply sat, back against the wall, knees pulled tight. When one of the nurses entered with a tray, the girl flinched so violently the food spilled. No scream, just silence, raw and impenetrable. She had no language, no gesture of meaning, no recognition of herself in the mirror. When spoken to, she didn't turn her head. But when certain tones were used, a high pitch, a sharp consonant, her eyelids twitched. Her mind was listening, not understanding, but receiving. That was the moment I knew. She was not empty. She was available. Every other patient I'd worked with came preloaded, full of trauma, language, bias, noise. But this girl, this experiment made flesh, had been denied the very thing that makes us human. Not just language, but interaction, intention. She was a mind with no imprint, no code, and I was being asked whether anything could be built on such barren ground. I volunteered before the question was finished. I was the only one who didn't flinch when I looked at her. The others saw damage. I saw potential. She wasn't broken, she was unformed. They assigned me full authority under the Institute's Cognitive Rehabilitation Grant. Technically, it fell under the branch of developmental linguistics, but I knew better. This wasn't rehabilitation, this was construction. I moved her to the language lab, a sterile, quiet environment with padded walls and dim, non-invasive lighting. No clocks, no windows, no sound, but what I allowed. She flinched at everything at first. The opening of the door, the shuffle of paper, even my breath when I leaned too close. But she never looked away. I sat in the observation booth for hours, just watching. No speaking, no recording. Just observing her body, how it twitched, how her eyes tracked shadows, how she rocked when the lights dimmed. These were not conscious reactions. They were patterns, loops, echoes of a childhood lived in stillness. I had seen what silence did to patients. But this was silence as a beginning, not an aftermath. On the 3rd day, I placed a red ball in front of her. She didn't touch it. On the 4th day, I said the word ball softly 3 times and placed it again. No reaction. On the 5th, I used a recording, my own voice saying ball, red ball, looped for 10 minutes. I placed it in front of her and left it running while she stared at the wall. By the 6th day, she began turning her head when the word played. Not a word, not comprehension, but movement towards sound. I logged it, time-stamped the footage, began planning more loops, colors, numbers, actions. She didn't know what the words meant, but I did, and that was enough. She became my daily ritual. I fed her scripts one phrase at a time. I removed all language not from me. I played her tapes while she ate, while she sat, while she slept. My voice became the world's only language in her universe. I wasn't just teaching her to speak. I was teaching her what speech is. Her silence, once unnerving, now felt sacred, a clean slate, a mirror, and when she blinked at me, slowly, as though waiting for her next phrase, I realized what I had been given. Not a child, a mouth waiting to speak. My words, I began with the simplest shapes, ball, cup, hand, paired with sounds, always my own voice, always precise. Each phrase was recorded in a neutral tone and played through a small speaker mounted in her room. There were no distractions, no other voices, no other input, just her and the loop. Ball, ball, red ball. This is a red ball. She would sit motionless for minutes at a time, gaze low, fingers twisting together like they remembered something her mind had long since forgotten. But her eyes, they tracked. When I said hand, she would glance at mine. When the phrase cup of water repeated, she would glance toward the table, though she never reached. This was progress. I adjusted my scripts, changed the cadence, slowed down syllables until they dragged like warm tar. She didn't react more, but I did. Every twitch of her lip, every blink during a noun. It meant connection, or suggestion, or both. It meant the possibility of speech lived somewhere, buried beneath the layers of unformed cognition. I replaced her environment completely. No staff were allowed to speak around her. All written language was removed. Mirrors were added instead, at strategic angles, so she could see her own face when mine moved. I would sit behind the glass, repeating words slowly, watching her reflection mimic the shape of my mouth with eerie accuracy. Still no voice, not a single sound of her own. But she was listening, and listening was the doorway. I designed a soundscape tailored to obedience. She slept with headphones, soft loops of affirmations layered under tones meant to ease resistance. I played them gently at first, short phrases like, "You are safe," "Words are good," "Repeat what you hear." The volume was barely audible. It didn't need to be loud, it only needed to be present. Within a week, she began mouthing along. Not words, just shapes, muscle movement, echoes without sound. I filmed her in darkness, infrared capturing the tiny tugs at her jaw as the loops played. She blinked in rhythm with my voice. She swallowed when I said, "Drink." She was becoming responsive in ways even she didn't understand. I logged everything. The angles of her pupils, the length of her stares, the order in which she mimicked sounds. But as I read back through the pages, something in my notes began to change. I stopped writing about her as a subject. I started writing as if she were a reflection, an extension of something I had built. She reacts to my voice only. She mimics my breathing. She does not move until I do. I began sleeping in the lab again, just outside her room. It wasn't required. I told the staff it was to reduce the variable of caretaker noise, but the truth was simpler. I didn't want to miss anything. I wanted to be there when the first sound emerged, not just as a researcher, as the source. I whispered through the speaker in the middle of the night, "Say what I say. Repeat me. Let me be your first word." Nothing, but sometimes she would shift, just slightly, as if something had moved through her, not understanding, but transmission. The more she mimicked, the more I believed she was imprinting, not learning, imprinting. Her silence wasn't a gap. It was a medium, a conduit. I removed even more from her space. Only the chair, the bed, the mirror, the voice. No light unless it was tied to command. I dimmed the room on cue, lit it when she looked up. My voice became her clock, her environment, her measure of presence, and slowly I stopped wondering if she was learning language. I started wondering if she was learning me. Every day she moved more like me, tilted her head the way I did, blinked when I blinked. It was not coincidence. She was copying more than speech. She was absorbing cadence, rhythm, pattern. Still she did not speak. But when I entered her room one morning and found her staring directly into the mirror, her lips moving in perfect time with mine from behind the glass, I knew she didn't have to. She already understood who the voice belonged to. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because the recording had looped for nearly 8 hours without interruption. I was behind the glass, documenting her eye movement, tracing the rhythm of her shoulders as she sat curled in the corner. She had grown eerily still over the last week, as if each syllable had slowed her metabolism. That day's loop was simple. Light. This is light. Look at the light. I watched her mouth move, first a twitch, then more deliberate. Her lips shaped the L, her jaw dropped slightly on the I. The sound didn't come, but the shape was unmistakable. Light. My pen fell from my hand. I replayed the footage. Again and again. I slowed it frame by frame. The motion was real, controlled. The first sign of outward speech. It was what every researcher dreams of, a mind, once silent, forming a bridge to expression. I was ecstatic. I entered her chamber slowly, carefully, as if not to break the spell. I crouched in front of her, held the object, a small flashlight, and repeated the word, light. She blinked once. Then she mouthed it again. But there was no focus in her eyes, no urgency, no spark, only movement. It wasn't language, it was imitation. I leaned in, searching her face for some indication of awareness, some flicker that the word meant something. But she only stared at the flashlight as if waiting for it to cue her again. Her lips moved. Not as an act of choice, but as reaction. I felt the thrill curdle. I wanted to believe she had said it, that she had chosen to engage, to reach across the silence. But what I saw was mechanical, a pattern recognition loop, a playback, not a voice, a mirror. I didn't stop the sessions. If anything, I increased their intensity. I changed the phrasing. I added emphasis, emotion, variation. I introduced new concepts, happy, sad, pain, mother. I showed her faces, smiling, crying, screaming. I narrated them. Then I showed her her own face in the mirror and asked her what she saw. She didn't answer, but she started responding. Tears came when the word mother played on repeat. Laughter, hollow, unearned, surfaced during clips labeled happy. She stared transfixed at footage of herself blinking, rewound endlessly, watching herself open and close and open again. It disturbed the nurses. They asked if she was hallucinating. I told them it was breakthrough, but deep inside I began to wonder, was this what language looked like? Or was it something else entirely? Was I witnessing comprehension or conditioning? I started to rewrite the scripts with layered intentions. I used my voice still, but I adjusted tone, softer for comfort, sharper for instruction. I inserted conflicting emotional commands to test her response. This is safe. This is not safe. Smile, now cry. Cry now. Her reactions were unpredictable. She began laughing at silence, weeping during loops of meaningless words like pencil or blue. One night, I walked into her chamber and found her curled into the corner, whispering sounds that didn't resemble any word I had taught her, but still mimicking the rhythm of speech. She was speaking ghosts, echoes of sounds I hadn't fed her. Where had they come from? Had they always been there? My notes changed. They became more erratic, less analytical. I began writing in past tense about events that hadn't yet occurred. She will say your name. She has already learned your breath. She will speak and it will not be for you. I started reviewing the tapes obsessively, not hers, mine. I played back my own voice, checking the sessions for inconsistencies, for contamination. But I started hearing background tones, subtle, pulsing, like a second rhythm beneath the words. Breathing not synced with mine. I wasn't teaching her to speak. I was feeding her a system, an architecture of response. And whatever she was becoming, it was following the blueprint. But not as a student, as a host. Because the word she mouthed that day wasn't hers, it was mine. I stopped pretending to go home. My cot moved permanently into the control room, wedged between the playback station and a wall of tapes labeled with the names of scripts I'd long stopped reviewing. I lived off vending machine coffee and the looped cadence of my own voice echoing back through cheap speakers. I told the board it was for consistency. The girl needed a single presence, a fixed voice. They approved my request with an uncomfortable nod. I think they believed I had grown attached. They didn't know that by then I had begun to suspect the attachment wasn't one way, because she started responding before I spoke. I would enter her room with the phrase prepared in my head, touch the red ball, look at the mirror, and before my lips could part, her head would turn toward the object. Her mouth would begin to move, soundless, but precise. Synced with the sentence I hadn't yet said aloud. At first I chalked it up to coincidence, then conditioning, then pattern anticipation. But it kept happening. She would blink in rhythm to my inner monologue, flinch before I made noise, tilt her head when I thought the word pain. She was listening, not to the room, to me. I reviewed old footage, watched earlier sessions frame by frame. I traced her eye movements and compared them to my heart rate, my breath, the unconscious sway of my body behind the glass. And the pattern was there, buried, but consistent. She wasn't reacting to what I said. She was reacting to what I intended to say. I began to test it. I would sit silently in the control room, stare at the monitor and think, say something. And she would. Random syllables, garbled consonants, but always in response. She wasn't parroting anymore. She was projecting. She was aligning herself to me in ways even I couldn't explain, like a chord struck in harmony with another, even across silence. That was when she began speaking words I never taught her, names, phrases, sentences I had written in private journals. Once, she mouthed a line from a dream I had scribbled down at 3 a.m. weeks earlier. The door never opened, it was always inside. I never said it aloud. I never even typed it. She began watching the mirror differently, not examining herself, but me, watching me through the reflection. I could feel her gaze even when I stood outside her chamber. It was like she no longer needed the glass to see through it, like she had memorized me completely. Her stare became invasive, not accusatory, not empty, just aware. I found myself avoiding her eyes. I turned off some of the lights, limited visual contact. I justified it as another isolation layer for data purity. But the truth was, I didn't want her to see what I had become. I didn't want her to know how afraid I was. I stopped letting staff inside. I stopped logging changes in her behavior. The study became secondary. She didn't need more scripts. She didn't need prompts. She was beyond them. And yet I couldn't stop watching her. Her movements became less human, not unnatural, just too precise. No wasted energy, no reflexive gestures. Everything she did felt measured, intentional, as if someone or something was controlling the performance from inside. Sometimes I would sit in the dark, just feet from the glass, and whisper, "What are you?" She would blink. Sometimes she'd smile. Once she mouthed back, "You." After that, I removed the clocks from the room, sealed off the hallway, covered the windows. The silence grew heavier. I forgot the sound of other voices. I forgot the taste of my own name. And still she watched me, as if waiting for a word I hadn't yet discovered, a word that already lived behind her eyes. She began speaking in voices I didn't recognize. Not many words, just fragments, slivers of language too precise to be mistakes. They didn't match the recordings, they didn't match my voice, yet they came from her lips, steady and soft, like someone replaying a sentence they'd never been taught, but somehow remembered. The first time it happened, I assumed I had misheard her. She said, "Return the hollow," while lying still in her bed, eyes wide open. I searched every script, every experimental file, every loop. I had never said those words, not once. A few days later, she whispered, "The root remembers," while touching her collarbone. Again, not mine, not anyone's. It escalated. She began mimicking handwriting from my old lab journals. I found pages torn from notebooks with notes I hadn't written. But the pen strokes were identical. The ink was fresh. The words were hers, phrases I had once jotted in dreams, half-conscious scrawls I never read aloud. Yet she knew them, she performed them. I stopped bringing in assistants. No one else was allowed to hear her. She only spoke when we were alone anyway. The moment another presence entered the room, even a nurse or tech, she fell silent. Blank again. Passive. But once it was just us, the voice returned. Different each time. Not entirely hers, but not foreign either. As if the voice was being tuned through her, not produced by her. I stopped testing her. I started recording her, not to track progress, not for documentation. I recorded her to listen. I would sit for hours at the playback console, headphones wrapped tight around my skull, replaying the sounds she made. Her tone, her breath, the unnatural fluency of a language I didn't know, and perhaps was never meant to. There was a rhythm to it, an architecture. Her voice carried weight, even when meaningless, as if every syllable wasn't just a sound, but a marker, a key, a memory not her own. One night, she recited a passage from a notebook I had buried under a stack of files, one I'd written during a personal collapse years before. The page was never shown, never read aloud. It included a phrase I had only ever thought about reading aloud. "She is not learning from us. We are remembering through her." She said it exactly, word for word. I no longer believed I was shaping her. She was opening, and something far older, far more complete than our language was moving through. I had believed in science. I had believed in structure, neuroplasticity, cognitive imprinting. But this was not cognition. This was possession, a gentle one, subtle, like mist filling a room you didn't know had windows. She was not gaining knowledge. She was revealing it, and I became obsessed with the sound of it. I recorded her laughter, which came unprovoked, but only after I had dreamed about it. I recorded her breath while she slept, and it matched the rhythm of an old lullaby my mother used to hum, one I hadn't heard in decades. She spoke my fears. She whispered names I hadn't spoken aloud since childhood. She described events I had witnessed but never told anyone about, as if she carried the shadows of every unspoken thing I had ever buried. Her mind was not linear. It was not developing. It was unfolding. A mind like that, it doesn't begin at birth. It doesn't start with language. It waits. She looked at me differently now, no longer as a teacher, not even as a presence. She looked at me as if I had joined her, as if I had finally stopped speaking long enough to remember what was already there. I kept recording, not because I wanted answers, but because I needed to hear what came next. I stopped calling it an experiment. There were no more scripts, no tests, no new phrases to introduce. I would sit across from her now, without clipboard or headset, and just speak, softly, freely, words I hadn't planned, thoughts I hadn't rehearsed, and she would answer, always in my voice, not an imitation, not mimicry, but structure, tone, sentence shape. She had absorbed me so completely that everything she returned came reassembled in the rhythm of my own language, rearranged with impossible precision, like listening to an echo with better timing than the original. She never used a word I hadn't used first, but the order was never quite the same. I asked her a question once. "What do you want?" and she looked at me for a long time before answering, "Want is shaped by repetition." I had said that years ago, in a lecture, offhand. It wasn't in any transcript. But it came back through her, cleaner, deeper, like the idea had lived inside her longer than I had. I started writing down everything she said, every word, not as data but scripture. I copied her phrasing in black ink, filled notebooks with dialogue that wasn't dialogue. There were no conversations, only reflections. And yet, she answered me, she responded, she engaged, only when I was present. That was the other shift. She stopped reacting to anyone else entirely. Nurses came and went and she stared through them. Techs adjusted equipment and she blinked without recognition. But the moment I entered the room, even in silence, her breath changed. Her head tilted, her fingers flexed. Her entire self became a waiting chamber, and I couldn't bear to be away from it. Because in the quiet of that room, in the dim hum of her voice giving me back to myself, I felt something I had never found in a textbook or a peer-reviewed paper. I felt understood, even if she had never once spoken her own word. I began to believe she had no original language, that we had emptied her too thoroughly, that we had poured so many repetitions into her that when she finally spoke, there was nothing left but echoes. But then came the night she said it. Repeat. One word, whispered in the dark. I hadn't said anything yet. I had only sat down, reached for my notebook, and she looked at me, not through me, and said it with weight. Repeat. I froze. It wasn't the word itself, it was the request, the implication that she wanted the cycle to begin again. Not because she needed instruction, but because she was waiting for it, as if I were the loop, the voice, the construct. I whispered back, "Repeat what?" She smiled, and I couldn't answer the question I had asked, because I no longer knew what I was repeating. I reviewed my notes later and realized most of what I had written in the past weeks were just iterations of her responses. My own phrases, recycled and refined. The feedback loop had grown so tight I couldn't tell who had said what first. Had I taught her anything? Or had she made me forget where my language ended? I looked at her the next morning, pale under the fluorescent lights, still and blinking, and I didn't see a student. I didn't see a girl. I saw a vessel. One we had filled with so many voices, she became the container of them all, the echo of intention, the architecture of suggestion. She was never made to speak for herself. We gave her a language that only repeats. We stripped her of origin and called it learning. And in doing so, we carved out a place inside her where we could hide the pieces of ourselves we didn't want to forget. Or worse, what we didn't want to admit we had given away. I don't know where she is now. They shut down the program, sealed the files, erased the footage. They called it inconclusive, unethical, unsustainable. But they didn't hear what I heard. She never needed the world's language. We gave her ours, piece by piece, syllable by syllable, until there was no space left for anything else. And now, she speaks, not aloud, not in dreams, but in me, in half-finished thoughts that don't feel mine, in words I never remember choosing, in quiet moments when my mouth moves before I know what I'll say. She's in the rhythm, the echo, the silence between questions. I used to wonder what kind of person she would become. Now I wonder how much of me she took when I made her speak. And if she still has a voice out there somewhere, maybe she's still speaking through mine.